An empire at its absolute peak of power issues a terrifying order. Every newborn son of its slave population must be thrown into the great river to drown. It's a calculated, cruel move designed to crush a people and secure a pharaoh's legacy. But one of these children, marked for death and set adrift in a simple basket, wasn't going to die in the water. Instead, he'd return, as if from the dead, to drown an entire army and bring that very empire to its knees. This isn't just the story of a prophet. This is the story of how a mother's single, desperate act of faith and a princess's surprising moment of compassion started a chain reaction. A reaction that would free a nation, redefine the idea of God, and change the course of human history forever. This is the story of how the quiet cry of a baby in a basket became a roar that toppled the most powerful kingdom on earth. In the heart of ancient Egypt, a community of immigrants, the Hebrews, had grown so large it made the Egyptians nervous. What started generations before as a welcome stay had soured into suspicion and fear. New Pharaoh saw a threat, not community. His solution was as brutal as it was systematic. First, he enslaved them, forcing them to build his great cities from mud and straw. But they just kept growing in number. So, the Pharaoh took his cruelty to the next level. He called in the Hebrew midwives and gave them a chilling order: kill every newborn male at birth. But in the first of many acts of quiet rebellion that define this story, the midwives, fearing God more than any pharaoh, said no. Furious, the pharaoh made his genocidal plan public. He commanded all his people to take any newborn Hebrew boy and throw him into the Nile River. The river, the very source of Egypt's life, was to become a graveyard for the children of Israel. It was in this world of terror and despair that a woman named Jochebed gave birth to a son. For 3 months, she and her husband Amram broke the law, hiding their baby from Egyptian patrols. Every little cry had to be muffled. Every moment was filled with the fear of being discovered, which would mean death for the whole family. But you can't hide a baby forever. As he grew, his cries got louder, and the risk became too great. Jochebed was stuck with an impossible choice: hand her son over to be killed by the state or figure something else out. What she did next wasn't abandonment. It was a profound and desperate act of faith. She couldn't hide him anymore, so she decided to give him up not to Pharaoh, but to God. She wove a small basket from papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch, creating a tiny little ark. She placed her beloved child inside and carried him to the banks of the Nile. She was using the very river meant to destroy her people as a vessel of her trust. She gently placed the basket in the thick reeds near the riverbank, a spot she knew the royal court often visited. While his mother stepped away to pray, the baby's older sister, Miriam, watched from a distance, her heart caught somewhere between hope and terror, waiting to see what would happen to her little brother. This wasn't a surrender. It was a strategic, faithful appeal to a power much higher than Pharaoh. And that's when divine providence, dressed up as royalty, stepped in. The Pharaoh's own daughter came down to the Nile to bathe, with her attendants walking along the riverbank. She saw the odd little basket in the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. When she opened the tiny ark, she saw the baby, and he was crying. The sound just pierced her heart. The Bible puts it simply: she felt sorry for him. In that one moment, basic human decency won out over politics. She knew right away this was a Hebrew child, a baby her own father had ordered to be killed. This was the turning point, the moment where history would pivot. The princess could have followed her father's cruel law. She could have ordered the basket and the baby to be thrown into the current. But she didn't. In an act of incredible compassion and stunning defiance, she chose life. Seeing her chance, Miriam came out of her hiding spot. With a courage that was amazing for her age, she walked up to the most powerful woman in the country and asked, "Should I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" The princess said yes. So Miriam ran and got the one person in the whole world who could comfort that crying child, his own mother, Jochebed. In a twist so perfect you could only call it a miracle, Pharaoh's daughter hired Jochebed to be the baby's nurse, paying her to take care of her own son. The child who was supposed to be a victim of the state was now a ward of the state, protected in the very home of the man who wanted him dead. The princess named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Moses grew up surrounded by unbelievable luxury and privilege. Raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he was taught all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He would have learned math, engineering, politics, and military strategy from the best tutors in the world's greatest empire. By all accounts, he was a prince of Egypt, mighty in words and deeds. But during those years, his mother nursed him. She gave him more than just milk. She planted the story of his people inside him. He knew he was a Hebrew. He knew that while he walked on polished palace floors, his family was sweating and toiling under the whip in the brickyards. This double life created a conflict that couldn't last. One day, after he had grown up, Moses went out to where his people were and saw their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian taskmaster brutally beating a Hebrew slave. In a flash of rage, Moses jumped in. Making sure no one was looking, he killed the Egyptian and buried his body in the sand. He had made his choice. His loyalty was with the oppressed, not the oppressor. The next day, he found out his secret was out. When Pharaoh heard about it, he wanted Moses dead, and the prince who had everything was forced to run for his life. He escaped Egypt and traveled to the land of Midian, a desolate wilderness. There, the prince became a shepherd, a fugitive in exile. For 40 years, the glamour of Egypt was just a distant memory. It was in this lonely place, stripped of everything he once was, that he was being prepared for his true calling. In that wilderness, God appeared to Moses in the vision of a burning bush of fire that burned but didn't consume the bush. He was commanded to go back to Egypt, to stand before the new Pharaoh and deliver a simple, world-shaking message: "Let my people go." Armed with divine authority, but full of self-doubt, Moses went back to the land of his birth and his exile. The stage was set. Moses, the former prince, stood before his adoptive brother, the Pharaoh, and demanded the release of the Hebrew slaves. The Pharaoh, his heart hardened by pride, refused, and so a battle began, not just between two men, but between the gods of Egypt and the god of the slaves. What came next was a terrifying, systematic takedown of the Egyptian empire and its gods. God unleashed 10 plagues, each one worse than the last. The Nile, their god Hapi, was turned to blood. Frogs, representing the goddess Heket, swarmed the land. Gnats and flies tormented the people. A terrible plague killed Egyptian livestock. Boils broke out on the Egyptians. A storm of hail and fire rained down, and swarms of locusts ate whatever was left. A thick, suffocating darkness covered Egypt for 3 days, a direct challenge to the sun god, Ra. With every plague, Moses repeated the demand, and with every plague, Pharaoh said no, his defiance growing even as his kingdom fell apart around him. The story of these plagues, and the final, devastating blow that finally broke an empire's will, is a powerful testament to faith against impossible odds. We explore stories just like this every week, digging into the moments in history where everything changed. If you find this story as fascinating as we do, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the epics that shaped our world. The 10th and final plague was the most horrifying of all. Moses delivered the final warning. At midnight, the angel of death would pass through Egypt, and the firstborn son in every Egyptian home, from Pharaoh's heir on the throne to the son of the lowest servant, would die. The Hebrews, though, were given a way to be saved. They were to sacrifice a lamb and mark their doorposts with its blood. When the destroyer passed over, it would see the blood and spare the lives inside. That night, a great cry of grief echoed across Egypt, because there wasn't a single house without someone dead. The crushing weight of this tragedy finally shattered Pharaoh's resistance. He called for Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night and begged them to take their people and just go. After 400 years of slavery, the Israelites were finally free. But a tyrant's change of heart doesn't last long. Soon after they left, Pharaoh, already regretting the loss of his entire slave workforce, gathered his army, his best chariots, and chased after them. The Israelites found themselves trapped, with the massive Red Sea in front of them, and the vengeful Egyptian army closing in behind. It looked like their freedom would be a short-lived prelude to slaughter, but it was right there, at the edge of absolute despair, that the promise that began in a basket was finally fulfilled. Moses stretched his hand out over the water, and a great wind parted the sea, creating a path of dry land for the people to cross. They walked right through the sea to safety. When the Egyptian army charged in after them, the walls of water crashed back down, drowning Pharaoh's chariots and soldiers. The very weapon Pharaoh had chosen for the Hebrews' death by water became his own army's tomb. An empire was brought to its knees, not by a rival army, but by the will of a God working through a man who was once a baby condemned to die. The journey was far from over. 40 years in the wilderness still awaited them. But the key event, the act of liberation that would define their identity for thousands of years, was complete. And it all started with a mother's faithful defiance and a princess's compassionate one. Jochebed's refusal to accept her son's death sentence and the princess's choice to save a crying baby were the sparks that lit a revolution. That single moment of kindness on the Nile, guided by a hidden hand, triggered the downfall of a superpower and the birth of a nation. It's a timeless reminder that the biggest changes in history often start with the smallest acts of courage, and that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't an emperor's decree, but the cry of a baby in a basket.